Hi, welcome to Educator.com and our series on Java. Today we're going to talk about loops. All right, first of all, loops are ways to repeat blocks of code. In older programming languages, they used to use a lot of go-to statements, and that got very tedious and it got confusing. So in modern programming languages, we have loops to repeat large blocks of code, or sometimes they're small blocks of code, but you want these things to be done many, many times. Sometimes it's only a few times, sometimes it's hundreds or even millions of times. And that would get really monotonous and difficult if you had to retype and include that code a million times because your text file would, be enormous. So there are types of loops, however, and we're going to get into what these types are, what they do, and how to distinguish and recognize them. All right, first of all, the for loop. A for loop uses the keyword for in Java, and it'll execute that block of code a specific number of times. So think about it in natural language or in pseudocode as if we're saying, repeat this loop for 10 times or for 20 times. Contrast this now with the while loop, and the while loop will execute the block of code only while a certain predefined condition is true. In other words, we're saying, do this loop of code while our variable is greater than 100, or while it's less than 100, or while x equals 5, or anything like that. So we're saying, do it while something is true. Then we've also got a do while loop. Now, the difference between a while loop and a do while loop is that the do while loop will do that block of code at least once, no matter what the counter condition is or no matter what the variable condition is. So the while loop, if it's set up in a certain way where it gets triggered to end immediately, the original loop of code does not get executed. Sometimes you want that to happen, sometimes you don't. If you know that you want that loop of code to execute at least once to start out with, then you've got to use a do while loop. So you're saying do it once and then evaluate whether the condition is true, whether you need to run it again or to break the loop and get out of it. All right, while you're running loops, you are going to need to get used to what we call increment and decrement operators. And these are used specifically with counters. And a counter is a sort of a side variable. And just like you'd be counting on your hands while you're counting something, you count your fingers. And while that loop is running, the counter is usually increased by 1. But increment and decrement operators can be done to increase counters, to decrease counters, and they don't even have to be used with counters. They could be used with anything. They could be used with any variable. But in conjunction with loops, they are definitely used to count the number of times the loop has run. All right, so let's take a look at the 4 basic ways to use these increment and decrement operators. First of all, it's all dependent on where you've got the plus plus or the minus minus. And so if the increment or decrement is before the variable, in other words, if we say plus plus x, then that would increase the variable or increase the counter and then use that number in the following code. The opposite is true with the decrement, where it would decrease it and then run the code. The post increment will run the code first and then increment or decrement the variable. And incidentally, this is where they get the programming language name C++, because C, like counter, and then you want to, usually in loops, you want to run the loop first and then increase the counter by 1. So that's the most common use of a loop, and so that's why they named it C++. Java is based on C++, so a lot of the language and syntax that you may know or may have learned in a C++ class, you're going to see this happening very similarly in Java too. Now let's go through some examples here about how these increment and decrement operators get used. Let's say that we're going to use a pre-increment operator and we set up our first variable to have an initial value of 5, okay? So then when we say that we want to change that variable to the new count, we say that the count gets incremented by 1 and then we add 2. So in all of these examples here, you're going to see that we have two things going on. We're going to increment or decrement the count, and then we're going to add 2. And depending on when those things happen, it's going to lead to different variable values. So in this first example, we've got the value of 5, and then we've got the new count, and then we increase the count by 1 and then add 2. So what happens there is that the count goes up by 1. Now the count is 5 plus 1, in other words 6, and then we add 2 to that. So at the end of it all, the count is 6, and the new count, because we added 2 to it, is 8. All right, let's contrast this with what happens if we decrement that value. Same setup here. We start with 5, and then we say decrease it by 1. So now the variable count is 4. So after this code is run, the variable count would be 4, and then we add 2 to it. 4 plus 2 is 6. So the new count after that little snippet of code is run, the new count would be 6, and the count would be 4. Then let's look at our post increment and decrement. So we start with 5 again. Here we say run the code first and then do the increment or decrement. All right, so here we start with 5 and then we immediately add 2. So now the new count is 7, and then we increase the count by 1. So the new count, so the original count ends up being 6. All right, and contrast that with the decrement. So we say 5, we start with 5, we immediately add 2 to it, so now the new count is 7 again, but then we say decrease. After that's done, then decrease, because we're using a post decrement. So it's whether it's pre or post, that determines when that count value is changed. So now we're saying post decrement that count value by 1 minus minus. In other words, take the count and then subtract 1 from it, and then we end up with the count being 4. So that's the difference between post-increment and pre-increment, or increment and decrement operators, pre-increment and post-decrement.